Prime Minister's spokesman has indicated that Labour will allow more than 100,000 illegal migrants to apply for asylum. Now, 90,000 of these were previously set to be removed under the previous government's Rwanda scheme. So are Labour starting as they mean to go on when it comes to migration? Ben, I'll start with you on this. James Cleverly, now the Shadow Home Secretary, is accusing Labour of essentially wanting an amnesty here, planning an amnesty of sorts. I mean, he would say that, wouldn't he? Is that what's happening here?
Well, there was an effective amnesty under the Conservative government. You know, Rwanda was nothing other than a performative scheme to distract the electorate while, actually nothing got better. You know, remember, we were paying under the Conservatives, we were paying £50,000 per head, per annum, per illegal migrant. I mean, that is huge. That added up to $5.5 billion last year. No wonder they want to come to this country. An individual in this country would have to earn close to £100,000 a year in order to get the benefits that the migrants were getting. Talk about an economic pull. Rwanda was always rubbish. £400 million spent on a scheme that was bound to be interfered with by the European Court of Justice, an exclusion that the wonderful Suella Braverman said she would make in the Illegal Migration Act, but even though it featured in the bill, there was no exclusion on the ECHR when the Act came to pass. The bill was drafted saying that anyone entering this country illegally would be detained and deported. When the Act came into being, it said they may be detained and deported. Big difference in wording. There was never going to be a result. There's only one way to stop illegal migration, and that is to stop people trying to enter our territory illegally. Border enforcement is a physical process which has, for thousands of years, taken place at the border. People used to understand that principle, that if you seek to enter someone's country illegally, you will be turned around physically. And that's what we need to do in the Channel. We need to develop the means to do it.
Well, Tom, it's very easy for the Labour Party in opposition to say, oh, this Rwanda scheme, it's inhumane, it's far too costly, it's inefficient, it's not going to work anyway. It's much harder when you face exactly the same problem. We know that about 300 people have already crossed today on the Channel. This problem is not going anywhere. It may well get far worse than we've seen already. And at the moment, smash the gangs is the policy.
We've got a new government. They've been in power for less than a week. They have a strategy, just like the last government did, but we know that Rishi Sunak called that election early because he knew that he was never in a cat-and-house chance going to get a so-called illegal migrant onto one of those planes. Those people have now been released. Labour has a plan to smash the gangs, and Yvette Cooper's already set up the border command.
I mean, you know as well as I do that we already had a very similar organisation.
The point is the Home Secretary...
It's a rebrand.
It's a rebrand for domestic organisation.
But the point is, we've had an election. The Home Secretaries before Yvette Cooper failed, along with the previous Prime Ministers, to get illegal migration and net migration down in this country. So there's nowhere to hide, is there, for this incoming Home Secretary? The boats are coming in. We get the numbers, we get the tallies. Huge number actually came in, as you said, Emily, in the last 24 hours. So if there isn't a trajectory of downward arrivals from across the Channel, that will be evidence that the smashing the criminal gangs strategy is not working. So I think we've got to give Labour the chance, because, Ben, in quite rightly, your diagnosis of the Tory failings on this, performative politics, costing us hundreds of millions of pounds, frankly, a gimmick. And as for having 100,000 people who are effectively we've made stateless, currently roaming our streets, undocumented, I think Labour's response to that is just outright pragmatic. Do you want undocumented people, potentially some of them could be criminals, roaming our streets? We need to get them documented,
yes, we're not getting
know who they are, and process their claims.
We're not getting any of that £270 million back. The Rwanda government have been very...
Go into the command.
Pardon?
We've saved £200 million that will go into the command.
OK, well, this command, there's a lot riding on this command centre, which does, to me, sound like rather a lot like a rebrand of something we already have. But, Ben, this is the difficulty, though. One thing that is very hard to get Yvette Cooper on, and we spoke to her a couple of times in the run-up to the vote in this general election, what to do with those who have gone through the asylum system, and apparently these 100,000 or so will be going through the asylum system, having their claims looked at. The ones who don't have their claim accepted, who are deemed to be illegal migrants, who have no case to be here under asylum, what happens to them? And that's where it gets a little bit tricky, isn't it, Ben? Because it's hard to send people back to many countries.
Well, you've got to have a deal with the country to which you wish to send them.
Which is near impossible in many cases.
If they're coming from Afghanistan, you can't deport them.
No, because, well, because that's a country that's just come out of war. You know, it's not even internationally recognised government, and we know what the Taliban does to its people. But let's just give another example. We've got 100,000, claims are not processed. I don't know what the proportion is because the government doesn't publish these figures, but we know that some of those people will be from, for example, Bangladesh. Safe country. Britain has good diplomatic relations with Bangladesh. We should be able to deport those people if it turns out they don't have a viable claim to be here. But we won't.
We won't, because we don't have the political will or inclination to do it. And nor does the Labour... I mean, the Labour Party definitely doesn't have the will to do it. The way they're going to deal with the asylum backlog is to wave it all through. I was going to say to you, of course, we can have the intellectual debate about where you deport people to because it's going to be difficult to do it. But that's a theoretical debate. You actually have to wish to deport someone before you hit that problem.
So you don't think, because, you know, Labour do point to their record when they were last in office, and they say we deported tens of thousands.
No.
Have things changed in terms of international law, in terms of all the restrictions we have, etc., etc.?
I'll tell you what happened under Labour.
Immigration...
We had a war in Iraq, which resulted in a spike in illegal migration. And as that war settled down and Iraq settled, the illegal migration settled. It has nothing to do with policies adopted by Labour back then.
Deportations, though? Were higher than they have been under the Conservatives.
Well, maybe we were able to deport people to Iraq because actually we controlled Iraq back in those days. But the other thing is there wasn't a Schengen zone in place back in the early 2000s. Yeah. And the Schengen zone... People keep saying we've left the EU, we've lost the ability to deport people back to the EU under the Dublin Agreement. Yeah. Actually, the Schengen zone is the single largest contributor to illegal movement of people across Europe.
Well, that is true because it's an open borders system. But all I was saying, actually, I think you're going to be surprised in terms of Labour Home Secretaries. You look back at David Blunkett, at Charles Clarke, even Tony Blair, of course, who's been on the airwaves and in the papers today about warning, actually, Labour to be tough on illegal and legal
he fears reform.
Migration. But actually, back in 2007, it was Tony Blair who was saying we need to change the UN Convention on Refugees.
Yeah, but hang on a minute. Tony Blair was very comfortable with mass immigration.
People in. But that's a separate issue about the accession 8 countries of the European Union.
That is true. That is true. Gary just says, has he stopped the gangs yet? Not yet, Gary, but we live in hope.